1597, Russian workers worked about 12 hours a day. They were fervently nationalist and believed in a benevolent czar that could solve their problems. 20 years later, we had the first socialist revolution. So the question is, what happened between 1897 and 1917? A very short period of time, and how do workers' ideas and agenda change so rapidly? And I was going to say that I'm going to attempt to answer that question in half an hour, but I think I'm going to encourage you to read my book. Hopefully that will partly answer it. And I think I'll leave it with just saying that I'll make some observations on that fairly large topic, and hopefully people can come in the discussion and give their own ideas. So while I do want to focus on 1917, I think it's important to say a few words about the pre-revolutionary period for a couple of reasons. First, I think for socialists today, there's probably, we dream of 1917, but the reality is we're still in the preparatory period. We have to think about how we're going to get from here to there and how socialists can intervene. And so I think it's an important topic in its own right. And then secondly, there's a lot of traditions from the pre-revolutionary period, especially with 1905, that just simply can't be ignored. Not that I can give a lecture on 1905, I'm just going to make a few points, but I think it's important when we talk about 1917 to make a few points about the period before it. And the two main themes of my talk are, first and foremost, Russian workers' ability to learn through struggle. That is, even without a revolutionary organization, January 9th, 1905, workers believed in Tsarism. They come to the Winter Palace with a fairly modest petition and are gunned down. That lesson, that the Tsar is no longer benevolent, is something that they would have learned without a revolutionary party. And that happens time and time again in the pre-revolutionary period, and also in 1917, that workers on their own have an ability to learn through struggle. And that's one of the things that people have read Lars Lee's book on Lenin, that the Bolsheviks were the extreme advocates of being optimists in terms of the revolutionary period, and the ability of workers to learn through struggle, I think, is important. But second, related to that, is the role of revolutionary organization. We don't want to simply dismiss that. In fact, it's a very key component. In fact, the notion that I like to use about what we mean by revolutionary organization is the notion of the party as sort of the memory of the class. And I'll give examples of that. Is that the party learns, it's a dialectical relationship. The party learns from the lessons of the working class, but also wants to keep those lessons alive. And especially like with the January 9th, 1905, the massacre of Bloody Sunday, and I'll give examples of that, of keeping that memory alive about what happened in the past. So lessons of 1905, again, 1905 in itself could be, I think, a very interesting discussion, but I want to just make a few points about 1905. First, Bloody Sunday, January 9th, 1905, 60,000 workers marched to the Winter Palace, as I mentioned, including, by the way, Bolsheviks. And sometimes people forget that even though they didn't agree with a lot of the demands, and this was essentially a police union, but the demands themselves were just. And because they were just, and because 60,000 workers were involved in it, the Bolsheviks felt they had to be there, even if they were critical of Father Gapon, as they rightfully were. But they had to be part of the movement. They were not on the outside, criticizing from the outside. So fairly modest, 100 killed, and in some ways this is probably the pivotal event of the pre-revolutionary period, because from thereafter, police unions, not just in Petrograd, but also in Moscow, were far more influential than the socialist-led unions. That is, most workers in Tsarist Russia believed, the ideas in any society, according to Marx, are the ideas of the ruling class. And at that time, people believed in a benevolent Tsar. Bloody Sunday completely changed that. That is, everything after that, even though some workers did still stick to the notion of a benevolent Tsar, but for the most part, if you look at the demands of workers, and there's petitions where, the first paragraph of the petitions prior to Bloody Sunday is basically how wonderful the Tsar is, and how great he is, and how they should grant them their wishes. After Bloody Sunday 1905, the petitions start, and this is a strong tradition within Russian culture, start with, we demand A, B, C, D. There's no longer the supplication, the appeal to the Tsar. So January 9th, 1905 is an important date. The second important date is the October Manifesto of that year, in which essentially the movement is divided. The liberals actually had influence within the working class movement something that's not talked about among socialists much, but prior to 1905, liberals actually did have a fairly strong influence within the working class movement. The October Manifesto, the short version of it is that the Tsar put forward a manifesto making vague promises of elections and some reforms. The liberals supported that, and essentially it split the movement. The workers' movement went on to, there ended up being a general strike in Moscow. But the liberals not only supported the manifesto, but they also supported what essentially was a repression against the popular movement. So the October Manifesto is important not only because it blew away any possibilities of reform, but it also discredited the liberals. And from thereafter, the working class movement is dominated by socialists of various varieties, the Bolsheviks, the Mensheviks, and the SR. So those two events are key. And the other thing that has to be mentioned about 1905 are the working class organizations, specifically the factory committees and the Soviets. That is, each factory had their own elected representatives to argue their case against management. And then on a citywide basis, there were workers' councils or Soviets that came into being that represented essentially the entire working class movement of cities such as Moscow or Petersburg and other cities. So those are sort of the important lessons of 1905. Now, the other thing, I should mention a couple things about how workers, their rights in Tsarist Russia. They were not even considered workers. They were considered peasants who happened to live in the cities and work in the factories. They were essentially almost as if they were peasants in the factories. That is, they had no political rights. They worked long hours, and one of the main features of Tsarist Russia is that after 1905, it becomes increasingly clear, especially given the role of the liberals, that there's no middle road. That is, there's either Tsarism, which is unwilling and incapable of instituting any meaningful reforms. The only one they instituted was the Duma, which met 4 times and was dismissed 4 times, and really was just an advisory elected representative body in which workers and peasants had a very tiny minority. So unable to institute any reforms, the political landscape was basically hang on to what we have, our rule, our privileges, our wealth, and everybody else. That is a huge gap, and that's obviously very different from the situation in the world today. Maybe not so, but maybe less so than it was a while ago. But a huge gap where socialists thereafter dominate the labor movement. The other point I wanted to sort of emphasize about the pre-revolutionary movement, which I think gets left out too often, is a fairly incredible strike movement from 1912 to 1917. 32 political strikes on a whole range of issues. The first one, the revival of the workers' movement after the defeat of the 1905 revolution. Basically, the number of strikers went from several million a year in 1905, 1906 to several thousand a few years later. The revival of that movement took place in 1912 with the Lena Massacre. One point is before that, it was actually a student movement that sort of acted as an impetus to the workers' movement. It was not this. The students themselves were just as alienated from the regime and the aspirations of Tsarism as were the workers. And there was a lot of interaction in the period 1910, 1911 between students and workers, organizing study groups and so forth. And I think if there's any one period that we can look back to and sort of compare to now, I think that's a pretty interesting period because a lot of agitation and a lot of cooperation between those on the far left to challenge Tsarism. But the strike movement itself really starts with the Lena Goldfield massacre in April of 1912. Between April 1912 and January 1917, there's 32 political strikes involving literally millions of workers that are over a whole range of issues. That is, May Day strikes, the anniversary of Bloody Sunday, January 9th. Every year there would be a political strike. No demands, just say, this is January 9th, this is our day, you slaughtered our workers on January 9th, 1905, we're not working today.